The alarm did not scream. That was the first wrong thing. On the windward chorus, alarms scream. They are built to scream, tuned by 3 generations of engineers, to cut through sleep, through drink, through the fog of a long patrol. But the alarm that woke me only hummed, low and patient, like something that already knew nobody was going anywhere. I am Nova Ashworth, sensor officer, 3rd watch, 7 years in this uniform, and until that moment I believed I understood the shape of danger in this part of space. Pirates, debris fields, the occasional territorial dispute between neighbors who still remembered old wars. Danger had a shape, and I could read it on a screen the way a farmer reads weather. I sat up in my bunk and looked at the hum. 1 contact, no transponder, no flight plan, no hail. I pulled on my boots without lacing them and walked the corridor to the bridge, and I remember thinking, this is probably nothing, the way you think that right before it becomes something. Captain Desmond Cray was already in his chair when I arrived, one hand pressed flat against the armrest, still as a man listening for a second heartbeat under the first. He did not turn around. Ashworth, tell me what I'm looking at. I looked at what he was looking at. A single vessel, hanging in open space, 40 kilometers off our bow. Long, gray, built in straight lines instead of the curves every civilized shipyard favored. Like whoever designed it had never once considered that a hull should look pleasant. No running lights, no comm chatter bleeding off its hull the way every other ship in the galaxy leaked a little conversation into the dark. It was not moving, not adrift moving, not damaged moving. Not moving the way something moves when it has decided, quite deliberately, to be still. Debris? Someone asked from the back of the bridge, hopeful. No emission signature matches debris, I said. It has power. It has systems. It has weapons, near as I can tell, though half of what's reading back doesn't match anything in the registry. Species? I ran it twice before I answered, because the answer felt wrong the first time, and I wanted it to feel less wrong the second. Human. The bridge went quiet in a way I had never heard it go quiet before. Not the silence of people listening, the silence of people remembering something they had spent years agreeing not to talk about. Every child in the coalition grows up with the stories. Every child learns, somewhere between their first lesson in orbital mechanics and their first heartbreak, that there is a line drawn across a stretch of empty space, and past that line lives a species we do not provoke. We do not trade with them unless they offer first. We do not send ships past the marker buoys unless we like our ships in one piece. We call it the fray line, and mostly we call it that with a laugh, the way you laugh about a monster from childhood stories that surely cannot still be under the bed. There is another phrase. Older, used less. My grandmother used it once, when I was small and asked why we never went east past the 3rd relay station. Don't wake the quiet one. I had thought it was superstition. Spacer talk. The kind of thing sailors say to feel important about their fear. I looked at the readout again. 40 kilometers off our bow. Doing nothing at all. And somehow doing nothing at all felt like the loudest thing I had ever seen a ship do. Hail it, Captain Cray said. We hailed it 7 times. 7 times, nothing came back but a flat carrier wave, steady as a held breath, telling us it was there, and telling us nothing else. Could be derelict, said Beckett, our comms officer, though his voice had climbed half an octave since the shift began, and he clearly did not believe himself. Derelict ships don't hold station, I said. Derelict ships drift. This one is parked. Cray finally turned his chair. His face had the look of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to finish. Log it. Full sensor sweep, passive only. Nobody so much as looks at a weapons console. We are a scout, not a provocation, and I intend for us to stay that way. I logged it. I ran the sweep, and for 6 hours, the human ship simply sat there in the dark, watching us watch it, and I began to understand that patience, when it belongs to something powerful enough not to need it, is its own kind of threat. We were not the only ones who noticed. Word travels fast between star systems that all use the same relay network, and by the time our second watch came on, 3 other coalition vessels had picked up the same contact from different angles, triangulating a ship that refused to so much as blink. The chatter on the command channel went from professional to nervous to something close to giddy. the particular giddy of people who have just found a very large, very strange animal, and have not yet decided if it is dangerous. That giddy did not last. A Skarn raiding pack found the human ship 4 hours after we did, and unlike us, the Skarn were not the type to sit quietly and file reports. I want to be fair to them, even now. I did not know them. I only watched what happened to them, recorded from 40 kilometers off, filtered through every sensor I had, and even secondhand it changed something in me that has not changed back. The Skarn were young. That much was obvious from their approach vector alone, a showy burn that spent twice the fuel a careful pilot would use, the kind of flying that says look at me before it says anything useful. 4 Raider-class ships, small and fast, and built for exactly one purpose, which was finding something rich and taking it apart before its owner noticed. They had clearly heard the old stories and decided the old stories were for children. I picked up their comm chatter, translated a half-second behind real time, and one voice came through clearer than the rest, cocky in the specific way that only gets you killed once. Would you look at that? Somebody left a whole warship sitting out here with the lights off. Somebody's about to have a very bad morning, and it isn't us. Laughter from the other raiders. I remember hating how young they sounded. On our bridge, nobody laughed. They're going to hit it, Beckett said. They're going to hit it, Cray agreed, and something in his voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man watching a child walk toward a busy road and knowing he is too far away to stop them. The Skarn raiders closed to 10 kilometers. 5, 2. The human ship did not power its weapons, did not raise shields, did not so much as adjust its heading by a single degree, as though 4 armed vessels closing for a kill were beneath the dignity of a response. I remember thinking, for one absurd second, that maybe the ship really was empty. Maybe it really was derelict, and the Skarn had gotten lucky, and we were all about to feel very foolish for our fear. Then the lead raider opened fire. I will describe what my instruments recorded, because what I recorded is stranger and more honest than anything I could invent. The Skarn weapon, a focused plasma lance built to crack open cargo holds without destroying the cargo, struck the human hull at point-blank range. And did nothing. Not deflected, not absorbed with a flare of shield energy the way coalition shields worked, all light and drama and a little show of effort. The plasma lance simply failed to matter, the way a wave fails to matter against a cliff that has stood there since before the wave's grandmother was rain. There was a pause. I could hear it in the Skarn chatter, a half-second of stunned silence, where 4 young pilots realized, together, that the thing they had woken up was not going to behave the way things were supposed to behave. Then the human ship fired back. I did not see 4 ships. One moment there were 4 raiders, spread in an attack formation, weapons hot, engines burning. The next moment there were 4 points of light, brief and clean, gone before the sound of my own breath had finished leaving my chest. No debris field, no wreckage drifting outward the way wreckage is supposed to drift, tumbling and burning and giving witnesses something to salvage or something to mourn. Just the space where 4 ships had been, and then the space where 4 ships were not, and the human vessel had not moved from its coordinates by more than a few meters the entire time, the way you do not move much when you swat something without breaking your stride. Nobody on my bridge spoke for a long moment. "Confirm," Cray said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of the flat calm he usually wore like a second uniform. "Confirm 4 Skarn vessels destroyed." "Confirmed," I said. My hands were shaking on the console, and I hated that they were shaking, and I could not make them stop. "Captain, it fired 1 time, 1 discharge. It took out all 4 ships with 1 discharge, and I cannot even isolate a clean signature for the weapon it used, because it doesn't match anything in our database. Nothing. Not a partial match. Nothing." Cray stood up from his chair. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the human ship, small and gray and patient, exactly as still as it had been 6 hours ago, as though it had not just erased 4 vessels, the way you erase a mistake from a page. "Recalculate our retreat vector," he said quietly. "Now, before anyone gives the order." I stared at him. "Sir, we haven't been ordered to." "Ashworth." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. That ship let 4 young idiots throw themselves at it because they were rude enough to try. We have not been rude. We have simply been present. I would like to keep it that way, and I would like us to be somewhere else by the time anyone in that ship decides presence is a problem too. I recalculated the retreat vector. My hands did not stop shaking for the rest of the watch. We did not run. Not exactly. Running, I would learn, was the wrong instinct entirely, and Captain Cray knew it even as he gave the order to prepare for it. You cannot run from something that has already seen you, the same way you cannot outrun a storm by driving faster than the wind. What you can do is stop being interesting. What you can do is become the kind of thing that a storm does not bother to notice. So we held position, quietly, respectfully. If a ship can hold position respectfully, engines idling low, sensors passive, every crew member on the windward chorus, moving through their duties like people trying not to wake something sleeping in the next room. The human ship did not leave. For 3 more days, it simply sat there, 40 kilometers off our bow, and I watched it the way you watch weather you cannot predict, cataloging every small detail my instruments could pull from its hull. I found no insignia, no markings that resembled any human iconography from the old trade archives, the handful of recordings and recovered data fragments the coalition had gathered from a century of careful, terrified distance. If this ship belonged to a nation, a fleet, a cause, it did not advertise the fact. It simply existed, armed and silent, the way a locked door exists whether or not you understand what is behind it. On the 4th day, Coalition High Command finally decided that silence needed an answer, and they sent an envoy. I was assigned as translator liaison. I want to be honest about how I felt when the order came through. I felt sick. Not afraid exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but sick, the way you feel sick before you have to have a conversation you already know will not go the way you hope. The envoy ship was called the Fair Accord, a diplomatic vessel built for exactly this kind of moment, gleaming and unarmed and carrying, I was told, 3 separate contingency protocols for first contact with an unknown hostile power. I remember reading those protocols on the shuttle over and thinking that whoever wrote them had never once imagined they might apply to us. Ambassador Priya Ren led the delegation. She was older than me by 20 years, silver-haired, calm, in the particular way that comes from decades of practice, rather than any real absence of fear, and she held my hand for a moment before we boarded, which surprised me, because I had not realized my hand needed holding until she took it. "You're the translator," she said. "I am. Then you understand this may not go the way translation usually goes." I did not understand. Not fully. Not yet. I understood an hour later, when the human ship finally answered our hail, not with a face, not with a voice exactly, but with a single line of text, relayed through an interpreter system, so smooth and so fast that it felt less like communication and more like a door being opened, just wide enough to let one sentence through, and no more. "We are not here for you. Leave us the reason to be." That was all. No greeting, no demand, no threat delivered with any heat behind it at all. I read it 3 times, and each time it felt colder than the last, because there was no anger in it, no menace, nothing I could point to and call hostile. It read the way you might tell a stranger to step back from a machine they did not understand, patient and bored, and entirely certain you would listen. Ambassador Ren asked me to draft a response, something about peaceful intentions, something about trade, dialogue, the long tradition of first contact protocols the coalition had refined over 2 centuries of meeting new neighbors. I drafted it. We sent it. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly, because the carrier wave stayed open, steady as ever, telling us the door had not closed, only that nobody on the other side of it felt any particular need to keep talking. We sat there for 6 more hours, transmitting variations on the same careful, hopeful message, and the human ship simply let us talk, the way you let a child finish an explanation you have already stopped needing. I remember turning to Ambassador Ren near the end of that long, useless day, and saying something I had not planned to say. "I don't think they're going to attack us." "No," she agreed. "I don't think they are, either." "Then why does it feel worse than if they had?" She did not answer right away. She looked out at the gray shape of the human ship, unmoving, unbothered, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the diplomatic warmth I had heard her use in briefings. "Because a threat, you understand, has a shape you can plan around, Nova. This has no shape. It simply has a boundary, and the boundary is telling us, very politely, that we have not yet crossed it. That is not safety. That is only the absence of a mistake, so far. We returned to the windward chorus with no treaty, no agreement, no real contact at all, beyond 11 words, that told us less about the humans than the silence before them had. And somewhere in that silence, in the space between a ship that would not fire and a species that would not explain itself, I understood for the first time that fear does not always come from what a thing does. Sometimes it comes from everything a thing could do, and chooses, patiently, not to. I did not know yet that the coalition would not let that patience stand. I did not know that somewhere in high command, 41 ships were already being called home from their patrols, their captains briefed on an anomaly that had killed 4 raiders in a single motionless discharge, their orders drafted around a single, catastrophic word. Neutralize. I only knew, standing on the bridge that night, watching the human ship hold its silent, unmoved position exactly where it had held it for 4 days straight, that something in the shape of the galaxy had changed, and none of us yet understood how much. I was recalled to Coalition Central Station 11 days later, along with every officer who had logged direct sensor contact with the human vessel. I did not know why until I stepped off the transport and found Captain Cray waiting for me in the docking bay, his face arranged into the particular stillness of a man who has already argued and already lost. "They're calling it the Ledger incident," he said, before I could even ask. 4 Skarn ships, gone. High Command wants it closed. Closed how? He did not answer. He only turned and walked, and I followed him through corridors that felt colder than I remembered, past officers who would not quite meet my eyes, until we reached the briefing hall, where 40 other captains and their liaisons were already seated, in rows that looked, from the doorway, uncomfortably like a funeral. Fleet Admiral Corwin Blake stood at the front. I had seen him twice before, at ceremonies, at a distance, a broad man with a voice built for large rooms and bigger decisions. He did not waste time on comfort. 4 days ago, an unregistered vessel destroyed a Skarn raiding party in Coalition space, without provocation beyond the raiders' own poor judgment, he said. That vessel remains in our territory. It has not moved. It has not identified itself, its origin, or its intentions, beyond a single transmitted line that our best analysts read as, at minimum, dismissive of coalition sovereignty. He let that settle. I watched the room absorb it, and I understood, even before he said the next part, that this room had already decided what it wanted to hear. "We do not know what this vessel is capable of, beyond what it has already shown us," Blake continued. "We do know that a single ship, sitting motionless in our space, has killed 4 vessels without so much as raising a shield. We do know that if we allow that to stand unanswered, we set a precedent that any power in this galaxy can violate our borders and our laws so long as they are willing to demonstrate enough force to make us afraid to respond." Ambassador Wren stood up 2 rows ahead of me. I recognized the set of her shoulders before she even spoke. "Admiral, respectfully, the vessel has made no move to expand its presence. It has not approached any coalition world. It destroyed 4 ships that fired on it first, unprovoked by any action of ours. I would call that restraint, not aggression." "I would call it patience," Blake said, "and I do not trust patience I cannot explain. Nobody in that room, I think, actually wanted a war. I want to be fair to them, all these years later, sitting with what I know now. They were frightened men and women, trying to make a frightening thing make sense, and the only tool any of them had ever been trained to use against fear was force, because force was the only language the galaxy had ever required them to speak fluently. They had spent 2 centuries building an alliance out of careful diplomacy and careful violence in exactly the right proportions, and nothing in their training had prepared them for a problem that could not be talked into a treaty or beaten into a retreat. So they voted. 41 ships. I remember the number because I remember counting them off the manifest later that night, unable to sleep, running my fingers down a list of names I had grown up admiring. The coalition's finest, drawn from 6-member species, combined arms doctrine refined over 140 years of small wars and careful lessons. Heavy cruisers with layered shielding that could shrug off a small moon's worth of ordnance, strike wings fast enough to outmaneuver anything short of light itself. Command ships bristling with enough coordinated firepower to level a planetary defense grid in an afternoon. It was, by every measure the coalition had ever used to measure such things, an overwhelming force. I was assigned to the command vessel, the Halcyon's Reach, as senior sensor liaison, a posting I did not ask for and could not decline. Captain Cray came with me, quieter than I had ever known him, and on the shuttle over he said something I have never forgotten. "You know what frightens me most, Ashworth?" "What, sir?" "That ship let 4 raiders die to make a point, and it made the point with a single shot. 41 of our finest are about to walk up and ask it to make a bigger one." I did not have an answer for that. I still do not. The Halcyon's Reach was commanded by Admiral Sorcha Bellwether, a woman with a reputation for precision so exact that her crews joked she scheduled her own breathing. I met her once, briefly, in the hours before we jumped into formation, and what I remember most is that she did not look afraid. She looked like a woman doing careful math, and the math, as far as she was concerned, favored us completely. 41 ships against 1, she told her senior staff, in a briefing I was permitted to observe from the back of the room. I do not care how strange its readings are. Mass and coordination win wars. They have always won wars. One ship, however capable, cannot be in 41 places at once, and we intend to prove that within the hour. I raised my hand. I do not know what possessed me to do it, surrounded by officers senior to me in every measurable way, but I raised my hand, and Bellwether, to her credit, allowed it. "Admiral, with respect, it didn't need to be in 4 places at once to remove 4 ships. It needed 1 shot, and it will need considerably more than 1 shot to remove 41, she said, not unkindly. The way you correct a student you believe means well, but has not yet grasped the scale of the lesson. Sit down, Lieutenant. Watch. Learn. I sat down. We jumped into formation 11 hours later, 41 ships, arranged in a doctrine so old and so carefully practiced that watching it assemble felt almost beautiful. A slow bloom of gray hulls, locking into position around a single, motionless point of light that had not moved from its coordinates in over 2 weeks. I ran a final sensor sweep before contact, the way I had run 100 sweeps before, and something in the data made my hands go still on the console. "Admiral," I said, "the target vessel's power signature hasn't changed. It's holding at the same output it's held for 2 weeks. It isn't charging weapons. It isn't raising shields. It isn't doing anything at all." "Then it hasn't noticed us yet," someone said, and there was a nervous laugh from somewhere behind me, the kind of laugh people make when they need to believe something more than they actually believe it. I did not laugh. I looked at the readout again, and I thought about the phrase my grandmother used to say, the one I had spent my whole life treating as a bedtime story instead of a warning. "Don't wake the quiet one." I think, now, that it had noticed us long before we noticed it. I think its stillness was never the stillness of something unaware. It was the stillness of something that had already made its decision and was simply waiting, with what I can only describe now as a kind of terrible courtesy, to see if we would make one too. Admiral Bellwether gave the order to hail. The response came back in under a second, the same clipped, bored cadence I remembered from the Fair Accord's failed contact 2 weeks earlier, relayed through an interpreter system that made every word sound like it cost the speaker nothing at all. "You were given a reason not to be here. You did not take it." "Formal notice," Bellwether said into the open channel, her voice steady, official, exactly the voice she would have used to address any coalition delegation. "You are in violation of coalition sovereign space. You will identify your origin, your affiliation, and your intentions, or you will withdraw beyond the fray line under escort." Silence. Not the dead silence of a closed channel, the open, patient silence of something listening and finding nothing worth answering. "Last opportunity," Bellwether said, and I heard, for the first time, the faintest crack of uncertainty beneath the precision in her voice. "Identify yourself." The silence held. Bellwether turned to her weapons officer. I watched her do it. I watched the exact moment 41 ships stopped being a deterrent and started being a decision, and even now, across all the years since, I do not know if I could have stopped what happened next, even if I had screamed every warning I had at the top of my lungs. Prime forward batteries, she said. All ships. On my mark. I closed my eyes. I do not know why. I think some part of me already understood that whatever happened next was not something I wanted to see with them open, and some other part of me, the sensor officer part, the part that had spent 7 years learning to watch, could not bring itself to look away. Mark. I opened my eyes in time to watch the beginning of the end of everything I thought I understood about power. 41 ships fired at once. I have run that moment back through my memory more times than I can count, trying to describe it fairly, and the closest I can come is this. It looked, for exactly 1 heartbeat, like victory. 100 separate weapon batteries lit the dark between us and the human ship, beams and rounds and torpedoes converging on a single point in space, with the kind of coordinated violence that had ended 3 wars in coalition history without ever failing once. For 1 heartbeat, I believed Admiral Bellwether's math. Then the human ship's shields came up, and everything I understood about shields stopped being true. Coalition shields glow. They are built to glow, a visible skin of light that flares and ripples under impact, giving crews and enemies alike a clear signal of how much punishment a vessel can still absorb before it breaks. It is, in its way, an honest technology. You can watch a coalition shield fail in real time, and know, to the second, when a ship is about to die. The human shield did not glow. It simply was not there, and then, for exactly as long as it needed to be, it was, a kind of hard nothing that our entire opening barrage struck and failed to pass through. No flare, no ripple, no visible strain at all. I watched 100 weapons discharge against a wall my sensors could not even properly measure, and when the barrage ended, the human ship's hull was exactly as clean as it had been before we fired. Impossible, someone said on the command channel, and I remember thinking, distantly, that impossible was becoming a very tired word. Bellwether did not hesitate. Whatever fear had cracked her voice earlier was gone now, replaced by the cold, working focus of a commander doing exactly what she had trained her whole life to do. Second wave, full spread, strike wings, converge from the flanks. The strike wings broke formation, fast little ships peeling off in graceful arcs meant to come at the human vessel from every angle at once, the kind of maneuver that had never failed against a single target in the history of coalition combat doctrine. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because it did not happen the way battles are supposed to happen, in a wall of fire and confusion too fast to follow. It happened in stages, and each stage felt less like combat and more like a lesson, delivered patiently, to a class that had not yet learned to stop raising its hand. The first stage took our shields. Not 1 ship's shields. All of them, 40 vessels worth, in a rolling wave that swept outward from the human ship's hull like something exhaling. I watched my own display flicker as the Halcyon's reach lost 60% shield capacity in under 3 seconds, and around us, on every channel, I heard the same confused, frightened reports coming in from ship after ship after ship. Shields down, shields failing, shields at 0, no visible cause, no identifiable weapon signature, just gone. The way a candle goes out when someone you cannot see leans down and blows on it. "What is that?" Bellwether said, and it was the first time I had heard her ask a question instead of give an order. "I don't know," I said, and I meant it more completely than I had ever meant anything in my career. "There's no discharge pattern, no energy spike I can trace back to the source. It's just removed, like it was never there." The second stage took our engines. I watched it happen to the ship nearest us on the display, a heavy cruiser, of the bright Fathom, one of the finest in the fleet. Its captain, a decorated veteran of 2 border conflicts. One moment it was accelerating into an attack run. The next moment it simply stopped, drifting. Every engine reading gone dark on my sensors at once. Not damaged, not destroyed, simply switched off, as though someone had reached across 40 kilometers of open space and turned a key. The crew of the Bright Fathom did not die in that moment. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters, even now, even after everything. They did not die. They only stopped being able to fight, drifting helpless in the dark while the battle raged on around them. And I remember thinking that this, more than anything, was the detail that would haunt me longest. The human ship was not trying to kill us. It was trying to stop us, and it clearly knew exactly how to do one without the other, which meant it had done this before. somewhere, to someone, enough times to make an art of the difference. The third stage took our comms. Ship after ship went dark on the command channel, not destroyed, not disabled in any way my instruments could explain, simply silent, and I understood, watching it happen, that this was not chaos. This was order. This was a system being dismantled piece by piece, in a sequence, the way you might disarm someone by taking their weapon, then their balance, then their voice, so that by the time you are finished, they cannot fight, cannot flee, and cannot even call for help. By the time the human ship reached the fourth stage, only 11 of our 41 vessels still had shields, engines, and comms all functioning at once, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, that the battle had never actually been a battle. It had been a demonstration, and we were the only ones in the room who had not yet realized the lesson was almost over. "Admiral," I said, my voice cracking in a way I did not try to hide, "recommend immediate withdrawal, all surviving ships, now." Bellwether did not answer right away. I watched her face on the secondary display, and I saw, for the first time since I had met her, something that was not precision. It was grief, arriving early, the grief of a commander who already understood how this would be remembered and had not yet found the words to give the order that would make it true. "All ships," she said finally, her voice steady, even though I knew what it must have cost her to make it steady. "Withdraw. Any vessel still capable of jump. Withdraw immediately. This is not a retreat. This is survival. Do you understand me? Survival." 11 ships jumped clear. I do not know, even now, whether the human vessel let them go or simply had no further interest in them once we had stopped advancing. I have turned that question over more times than any other question from that day, because the answer changes everything about how I understand what happened, and I have never found an answer I trust. What I do know is this: 30 ships did not make it to a jump point in time. 30 ships sat dead in space, shields down, engines dark, crews trapped and helpless, while the human vessel completed whatever calculation it had been running since the moment we first fired, and I watched, from the bridge of the Halcyon's reach, as it began, methodically, without haste, without anything I could call anger, to finish what we had started. I will not describe every ship. I do not think I could, even if I tried, and I do not think it would serve any purpose beyond cruelty to try. I will describe one, because it is the one I watched happen closest to us, close enough that I could read the ship's name off my own display, in the seconds before it stopped existing. The Verity's Hope, a support cruiser, older than most of the fleet, carrying a crew of 206, most of them technicians and medical staff, the kind of ship that exists to keep other ships fighting rather than to fight itself. It had no weapons worth mentioning. It had already lost its engines in the second stage, already lost its shields in the first, and it drifted, dark and helpless, directly in the human vessel's path as the larger ship began, for the first time in the entire engagement, to actually move. I do not know if the Verity's Hope was a target or simply an obstacle. I have never known, and I suspect now that I never will. I only know that the human ship passed near it, close enough that my sensors registered the proximity as a warning, and in the half-second after that warning, the Verity's Hope stopped registering on my display at all. No explosion. No debris field, the way I had already learned, from the Skarn raiders, weeks before, not to expect one. Simply the presence of 206 people, and then, without transition, without any moment I could point to and call the moment, the absence of them. I heard someone on the bridge start to cry. I do not know who. I did not turn to look. I could not take my eyes off the display, off the space where a ship full of people had been, running the numbers over and over in my head, the way you check a wound you already know is fatal, hoping the second count will be kinder than the first. It never was. By the time Admiral Bellwether gave the final order to withdraw the remaining ships, whatever ships still could withdraw, 22 vessels had been removed from the Coalition fleet roster in under 40 minutes. Not damaged, not disabled, removed, the way you remove a line from a page, and I understood, watching the human ship return to its original coordinates and go still again, exactly as still as it had been the day I first found it, that we had not been fighting a battle at all. We had been asking a question, the way the Skarn raiders had asked it weeks before us, and the answer had simply arrived at a scale that matched the size of our asking. The Halcyon's reach made it clear. I do not know why. I do not know if it mattered to the human ship whether we lived or died, or if the command vessel's survival was simply an accident of position, a matter of being far enough back in the formation that whatever calculation governed the human ship's actions never quite reached us before the engagement ended. I have never been able to answer that question either, and I have stopped trying, because I think some questions are not meant to be answered. I think some questions are meant to sit in you, unresolved, reminding you of exactly how small your understanding really was. We jumped for home in silence. Nobody on the bridge spoke for the first 2 hours of that journey, and when someone finally did speak, it was only to read off the names of the ships that had not made it, one at a time, slow and careful, the way you read a list of names you intend to remember for the rest of your life. I remember Captain Cray finding me afterward, in the narrow corridor outside the sensor bay, both of us still in the uniforms we had been wearing when the engagement began, neither of us quite able to look the other in the eye. You said it would need more than one shot, I said, because I did not know what else to say, and because some cruel part of me needed to say it out loud to someone who had been in that room with me. I know what I said. His voice had none of its usual command in it. It sounded, for the first time since I had known him, like the voice of a much older man. I was wrong, Ashworth. I have never in my career been so completely, catastrophically wrong. What do we do now? He did not answer right away. He looked past me, down the corridor, toward the bridge, toward the long dark space beyond it where, somewhere, a single gray ship sat motionless once more, patient as it had always been, waiting to see if we had finally learned the lesson it had been trying, in its cold and terrible way, to teach us all along. Now, he said quietly, we go home, and we tell them the truth, whether or not they want to hear it. They debriefed me for 6 straight days after we returned to Coalition Central Station, and I want to describe what that felt like, because I do not think anyone who has not lived through something like it can understand how strange it is to be disbelieved about your own memory. I sat across a table from officers who had not been there, in a room with no windows, and I told them what I had seen, in order, as carefully as I could manage. The shields that would not glow, the engines that switched off like a hand closing over a candle, the Verity's Hope, gone in half a second, 206 people erased without so much as a flare of light to mark that they had ever existed. I watched the officer across from me write notes I could not read, and every so often he would stop writing and look up at me with an expression I came to recognize over those 6 days, an expression that was not quite disbelief, but was not quite belief either. It was the look of a person trying to fit an impossible thing into a shape small enough to file away, and finding that no matter how they turned it, the thing simply would not fit. You're certain there was no discharge signature, he said, for the 4th time that week. No energy spike, nothing our instruments could have missed. I am certain, I said, for the 4th time that week. I ran every scan I had. I ran them twice. There was nothing to trace, because whatever they used, it wasn't built to be traced. It was built to work, quietly, and then to stop, and to leave nothing behind for people like me to study afterward. He wrote that down too. I do not know if it changed anything. I do not know if any of what I said, across 6 days of careful, exhausted testimony, changed anything at all, because the decisions that mattered were not being made by the officer across the table from me. They were being made in rooms I was never invited into, by people who had also not been there, weighing a report they could not fully believe against a fear they could not fully explain. And I have come to understand, in the years since, that this is how most history actually gets written, not by the people who lived it, by the people who read about it afterward, and decide, in rooms with no windows, what it is allowed to mean. Ambassador Priya Ren found me on the 5th day, in the small mess hall reserved for debriefing staff, and she looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier, the kind of older that does not come from time. I heard what happened, she said, sitting across from me without asking. I am sorry, Nova. I should have argued harder. You did argue, I said. Nobody listened. No, she agreed. Nobody listened. I have spent a long career learning that this is usually how the worst decisions get made. Not because no one warned against them, because the warning wasn't loud enough to compete with the fear. We sat together for a while without speaking. I remember being grateful for that silence, because it was the first silence in 6 days that had not felt like an accusation. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. "Now the Concord meets," she said, "and I expect, for once in my long and frustrating career, that they will actually listen to the numbers, because the numbers no longer leave room for pride." She was right. I was not in the room when the Concord convened. 3 days later, representatives from all 17 member species gathered to decide what the coalition's official response to the Ledger incident, as it was still being called, though nobody who had lived it called it that anymore, would be. I only saw the results, the way most of us saw the results, filtering down through official channels over the following weeks, each new directive a little more careful, a little more subdued than the one before it. The first directive withdrew every coalition patrol from the systems nearest the fray line, effective immediately. No debate, no vote required. 12 border systems, quietly redrawn on official star charts as human-adjacent space, a phrase that meant nothing and everything at once, a phrase that told any coalition citizen who bothered to read the fine print exactly how far the boundary of safety had just moved, and in which direction. The second directive ordered the immediate cessation of any armed engagement with unidentified vessels matching the profile logged during the Ledger incident, replaced instead with a standing order to observe, report, and withdraw. I remember reading that directive and thinking of Admiral Bellwether's voice in the moment before she gave the order to fire, the certainty in it, the math she had trusted completely, and I thought about how much easier this new directive would have been to write if it had existed 3 weeks earlier. The third directive was the one that stayed with me longest, because it was not really a directive at all. It was closer to an acknowledgement, buried in the official language of Concord policy, that the coalition's 2 centuries of careful expansion had, without anyone quite noticing when it happened, reached the edge of something it did not understand, and was not equipped to challenge. I read that acknowledgement more times than I probably should have. I read it the way you read a letter from someone who has finally admitted something you always suspected, but were never allowed to say out loud. I was released from active censor duty 4 months after the Ledger incident, not disciplined, not dismissed, simply reassigned to a training post on Central Station, where I taught new recruits the fundamentals of passive scanning, the same fundamentals I had used, all those months ago, to log the first quiet reading of a ship that would go on to unmake everything I thought I understood about power. I kept my original sensor log from that first night, the one where the ship did nothing at all, sitting silent and unmoving 40 kilometers off our bow, while my hands shook on the console and Captain Cray recalculated our retreat vector before anyone gave the order. I was not supposed to keep it. Regulations required it to be surrendered along with every other piece of data collected during the incident, filed away in an archive most of us would never be cleared to access again. I kept it anyway. I do not know why, except that I had begun to think of it, somewhere in those long months of debriefing and reassignment, not as evidence, but as a question, and I did not want to lose the only copy of the question I had ever personally witnessed being asked. Because that is what I came to believe, sitting alone in my new quarters on Central Station, running that old log back one more time on a private viewer. The ship's stillness in those first days was never mercy, the way some part of me had wanted to believe, back when I still needed to believe that a species capable of such quiet, complete violence might also be capable of quiet, complete kindness. It was a question. Are you going to make me do this? We answered it wrong. Not because we were foolish, exactly, though I have spent a great deal of time since then deciding how much foolishness played a part. We answered it wrong because we had never, in 200 years of careful expansion and careful war, encountered a power that measured its own restraint the way that ship measured its restraint. Patient past the point where patience made any sense to us at all, and so we mistook the patience for weakness, the way you might mistake a locked door for an empty room, simply because no one has answered your knock. I do not know what became of that ship. I have looked, in the years since, through every official channel still open to me, and I have found nothing beyond a handful of unconfirmed reports, whispers really, from freighter captains and border patrols who claim to have seen something matching its profile, still holding position somewhere along the edges of what we now quietly call human-adjacent space, still saying nothing, still waiting. I do not know if it is the same ship. I do not know if there are more of them, scattered along that long, careful boundary, each one holding its own silent question for anyone foolish enough to come close enough to ask it. I have come to suspect, though I cannot prove it, that the answer to both questions is yes, and that the quiet we so casually joked about, back when I was young enough to think of it as a bedtime story instead of a warning, was never quiet at all. It was simply a species that had already fought its wars, somewhere far beyond anything our star charts recorded, and had learned, at some terrible cost we will probably never fully understand, exactly how much violence it takes to make an entire species stop asking for more. We asked anyway. 41 ships, and every young Skarn raider who ever laughed at an old warning, and every officer in every briefing room who trusted the comfortable arithmetic of mass and coordination over the plain evidence sitting quietly in front of them. We asked, and it answered, and I do not think, in all the years since, that anyone in coalition space has needed to ask again. 6 years passed before I saw anything like it again, and by then, I had stopped expecting to. I had settled fully into the training post by that point, teaching passive scanning to recruits young enough that the Ledger incident was, to them, a case study and a manual, rather than a memory that still woke me some nights with my hands already shaking, before I understood why. I did not talk about it in class beyond what the manual required. I found I could not without my voice doing something I did not want 30 recruits to watch it do. There was one recruit that year I remember more clearly than the rest, a young man named Callum Ferris, sharp in the specific way that made instructors nervous, the kind of sharp that asks questions nobody else in the room has thought to ask yet. He found me after class one afternoon, holding a data slate with the official Ledger incident report open on the screen, the sanitized version, the one released to training staff with most of the raw sensor logs stripped out. "Lieutenant Ashworth," he said, "you were there. Sensor duty, Halcyon's reach."
I was.
The report says our shields failed due to an unidentified energy weapon, but the timing doesn't work. 30 ships losing shields in under 3 seconds, across a formation spread over 40 kilometers. Nothing we have moves that fast, not even light-speed weapons, not with that kind of precision across that kind of distance. I looked at him for a long moment. I had spent 6 years watching officers senior to me write careful, comfortable explanations for something I had watched happen with my own eyes, and here was a recruit, barely out of training, who had noticed the seam in the story within a single afternoon of reading. "It wasn't a weapon," I said, "not the way we use that word." Then what was it? I thought about how to answer that honestly, the way I had never quite managed to answer it in 6 years of debriefings and reports, and careful official summaries. I thought about the shields that did not glow, the engines that switched off like a hand closing over a candle, the terrible, patient order of it all, stage after stage, a lesson delivered by something that had clearly taught this lesson before, to someone, somewhere, and had refined the teaching until it required almost no effort at all. "I think," I said slowly, "that what we saw was a species so far past the kind of war we understand that our weapons, and their weapons, aren't even the same category of thing anymore. We build things that break other things. I believe they build things that simply decide other things should stop, and the deciding is the whole of it. There's no impact to measure, no energy to trace, just the choice, and then the result of the choice, arriving without anything in between." Callum was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "That's not in any manual," he said. "No," I agreed, "it isn't. I don't think it ever will be, because I don't think anyone who writes manuals wants to admit how completely we misjudged the shape of what we were dealing with. It's easier to write down a number for shield failure and move on to the next lesson." He looked back down at the data slate, at the sanitized numbers that told a story careful enough to be taught to children without frightening them, and I watched something shift in his face, the particular shift of a young person realizing, for the first time, that the adults who are supposed to have already figured out the frightening things have not actually figured them out at all. "Do you think they're still out there?" he asked. "Watching the border?" "I think," I said, "that they were always out there, long before we noticed them, and I think the only thing that changed 6 years ago is that we finally noticed them back. I don't know what that means for the future. I only know what it meant for us, and I think the honest lesson isn't about their weapons at all." "Then what is it?" I thought about Admiral Bellwether's voice, steady even at the end, giving the order to withdraw with a grief in it she had not let herself show until there was no other choice. I thought about the Verity's hope, 206 people who had trusted a chain of command built on confident arithmetic that turned out to be wrong in every particular that mattered. I thought about my grandmother's voice, older than any of it, warning a version of me too young to understand what she meant. The lesson, I said, is that patience from something powerful is not the same as safety. We had 2 weeks to learn that lesson quietly, watching a ship that did nothing at all, and we spent those 2 weeks deciding its stillness meant weakness instead of restraint. I don't think that mistake was stupidity, Callum. I think it was simply the mistake every species makes the first time it meets something it cannot outthink or outfight, because our whole history had never given us a reason to imagine such a thing existed. He did not have an answer for that, and I did not expect one. He thanked me, quietly, and left, and I sat alone in the empty classroom for a long while afterward, the way I had learned to do in the years since the ledger incident, letting the old memory run its course before I trusted myself to stand. I think about that ship often, even now. I think about the 11 words it gave us, the only real words it ever gave anyone, as far as I have ever been able to confirm. We are not here for you. Leave us the reason to be. I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count, in more moods than I can count, and I have come to believe it was never a threat at all. It was an offer, made once, plainly, without decoration, the way you might offer a warning to someone standing too close to a machine they do not understand. We did not take it, and I do not believe, even now, that the ship held that against us, the way a person might hold a grudge. I do not think it was capable of grudges, or perhaps I only tell myself that because the alternative, that something so powerful might also carry the same small, bitter feelings we carry, is more frightening than I have room for. What I believe, sitting here years later with an old sensor log I was never supposed to keep, is simpler than any of that. I believe the humans, whoever and wherever they truly are, beyond the fray line and beyond every careful old story we told ourselves about them, had already learned the cost of the kind of power they carried, somewhere long before we ever crossed their path. I believe that cost taught them a restraint deeper than anything the coalition had ever needed to develop, because we had never yet been powerful enough, dangerous enough, to require it of ourselves. I believe that restraint is the real reason 22 ships were the only cost of our mistake, instead of every ship we sent, instead of every world behind them. I believe the quiet ship that first appeared off our bow, patient and still for 2 long weeks, could have ended the engagement in its opening seconds, rather than its closing ones, and chose, for reasons I will never fully understand, to give us those 2 weeks first. We did not take the offer. We fired instead, 41 ships strong, certain that mass and coordination would settle the question the way mass and coordination had always settled every question before. I do not think the galaxy makes that mistake again. Not because we told it not to, not because any treaty or directive could carry that weight on its own, but because every officer who survived the Ledger incident carried the memory home with them, into training posts and command chairs and quiet conversations with sharp young recruits who noticed the seams in official reports. And slowly, over years, the old stories stopped being stories at all. They became something closer to what my grandmother always meant them to be. Not a bedtime tale to make children behave. A map, drawn in the plainest language available, of exactly where the edge of the world actually sits, and exactly how much silence stands between us and whatever waits, patient and unmoved, on the other side of it. I still keep the log. I still watch it sometimes, late at night, the ship holding perfectly still 40 kilometers off our bow, doing nothing at all, and I still feel, every single time, the same cold certainty I felt the very first night I saw it. It was never doing nothing. It was simply waiting to see whether we would learn to listen before it had to teach us the alternative. And across all the years since, that is the only lesson from that terrible, quiet day that I have never once needed anyone to explain to me twice.